I am ready. Thanks, John. All right, well, hi everybody. And if you don't know me, I know several of you here, but if you don't know me, I'm Stephanie Pritchard. I was a faculty member in the English and Creative Writing department. I very recently moved to the Office of Learning Services, and I am the new coordinator of the Writing Center. Today is actually my very first day in that role, so I'm very excited. I am going to continue doing a lot of the work with artificial intelligence that I had been doing in my previous role. So I've got this workshop, and then there will be other workshops and other resources that I will be happy to share with you as I continue to work this semester. So before I get started, I do have like some slides and information in the whole thing, but I am curious just to kind of like read the room and see where you all stand. So if you don't mind popping a quick response in the chat, how familiar, excuse me, I've been talking for several hours now. How familiar are you with different kinds of generative AI? Very much so, like you use it on a regular basis, somewhat, like you've used it once or twice and seen it used once or twice, or not very, or not at all. And I basically just want to see where everybody's at, so that I know how to go about this. Perfect. You are definitely in the right place then. So I've tailored this presentation to be sort of like pretty general, and very introductory to kind of just talk about what generative AI is, what makes generative AI different from other kinds of AI tools, some general information about AI that I think is very important for people to know, and then, just some kind of just other stuff, right? And then toward the end, I will play with one generative AI tool a little bit so that you can see what it looks like, and see some of the things that it's capable of. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see this. And please forgive the slides, but I don't know. It's hard on Zoom to just talk, right? And I like to look at something. So here we go. I am very happy to share this with you at the end of the presentation if you would like it. I do have several clickable links and a list of references at the end if you want to learn more information. So if I forget to do that before the session is over, then just yell at me, okay? And I will be happy to do that. Everybody can see this okay? Awesome. Thank you. All right, so the first thing that I want to do, and forgive this, right? But I've noticed more recently that, like AI is being used sort of like as a very broad term, right? When we're referring to different kinds of artificial intelligence. So I want to make a very clear distinction between AI and generative AI, and then the rest of this presentation will focus on generative AI, which is what we've been seeing a lot of in higher education over the last year. So, AI in general, right, is referring to machines or computers that can simulate, which I think is a very, very appropriate word, tasks that humans usually do, right? And it's so interesting when you sit down and start to think about how AI has been really integrated into our lives so seamlessly in all of these different ways that we might not even think about. So, for example, if you have any kind of like entertainment system at home, if you subscribe to something like Netflix or Disney Plus or Hulu, it's really interesting that when you finish watching a show, you will get recommendations for other shows that you might like, right? That's artificial intelligence embedded into that platform. Obviously, like there are tools like Autopilot, which is like a really straightforward one. And then also how AI has been integrated into the different kinds of shopping that we do, right? Or the different suggestions that we see, or the advertisements that we see, like online, if you're on social media or if you're just browsing, right? You'll notice that you start to see things that you've maybe been searching for previously or things that you might find interesting. Can anybody, because I don't want to just talk the whole time, that's boring. Can anybody give me other examples of like ways that like AI has been integrated into your life or things that you use that have artificial intelligence? Yeah, just shout them
Yes.
out. Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh,
Thanks.
um, Google suggested typing. Is that is that one example?
Yeah, absolutely.
for
How
your
like
Gmail. Yeah.
yeah, if you're typing in your Gmail or in like a Google Doc or something, and how it's predictive text, right? It will suggest how you might be able to finish your sentence. Yep, that's a wonderful example. Thank you. Maybe like one more. John, can you think of any? That's a good start. I'm blanking also. John and I haven't had lunch yet today. We're gonna blame it on that. All right. So, if we keep going, right, then we're thinking about AI like in our everyday lives, and now we're going to talk about generative AI, right, which is artificial intelligence that is used specifically for content creation. So these sorts of AIs are the ones that we're seeing a lot of in higher education, and that this is where all the conversation is kind of happening. So a lot of generative AI is programmed using something called a language model. So the AIs are like programmed with words and with content, right? Not just words, because generative AI can create words, but it can also create images and a whole bunch of other stuff, which we'll talk about later. But generative AI basically works by using the content that it has been programmed with in order to create content for its users. So I'm really going to focus later on just one kind of generative AI, which is ChatGPT, which is the one that everybody has been talking about a whole lot. But there are so many different kinds of generative AI models at this time, and there are newer ones that are kind of like coming out every single day. So some of the popular ones, right, which you have most likely heard of, ChatGPT, which is has both a free version and a paid version. The paid version, it can do all kinds of really crazy stuff. There is also another which is most and ChatGPT is mostly used to generate writing, although it can do other stuff. But when it first piloted, it could generate writing. There's also another generative AI that's called Dolly, which can create different kinds of artwork. So that is something that you have to pay for, but it can do all kinds of stuff. So like some examples, you can type in to this generative AI something along the lines of create a picture of a dragon, right? You could type that in and it will make a picture of a dragon for you. You could say, take this picture of a dragon that I made with colored pencils and make it look like something that I would see on TV. And it can do that, right? It can simulate all kinds of different artwork and do all kinds of really crazy things. The last one that I'll highlight is Google's Bard. This is a free AI, which can basically be used to like search the web. So three different ones, three different examples. Like I mentioned, though, there are so many and they can do so many things. You can go to Google, right? And you can ask for like a list of the most popular generative AI tools, and it will give you this enormous thing, right? And they can do all kinds of stuff. I'm not going to get into all of the different ones today, but I would be happy to like send you to some resources where you can find what they can do. I don't
Stephanie,
know. I don't. No.
Stephanie, if somebody's taking pictures with their cell phone, I know there's some of them we can actually click on it and it'll get put the person's facing forward if person's on an angle. Would that be the generative AI or the regular AI?
That would likely be generative. Well, it could probably be both because I know that there are different like filters and different applications and stuff that can do all kinds of stuff. The generative AI is mostly going to be like creating stuff. John, do you know the answer to Scott's question?
It's somewhere in between, actually.
Yeah.
Generative AI, the large language models, are based on text inputs that are then converted and that are recombined based on the probability that words will follow each other. The models of creating 3D images based on two-dimensional projections, or using fixed rules or proportions and so forth. That's, it's AI, but um, it's more formulaic, which is a more traditional type of AI.
Does that help, Scott? Yeah, awesome. All right, so here's like just some general context, right? So OpenAI, that's the company that created ChatGPT and Dolly, launched in fall 2022, as we know, right? Many people were talking about it in November, right? And within 2 months, ChatGPT had more than 100 million active users, which like blows my mind so much. And then like I found for context, it took TikTok, which is a really popular social media app, about 9 months to reach that number of active users. And TikTok is like huge, right? And then it took Instagram, which is another social media application, about 2.5 years to reach that number of active users. So it's something that really skyrocketed and took off very, very quickly. That is a good question, Sarah. The Oz Concerns Navigator, and if that would be considered AI. You can use generative AI to answer like frequently asked questions, right? You can like program it that way to kind of do so. Um, it might have, I mean, I'm sure it has some kind of, because the responses come through quickly, don't they? Like you submit a response and then it like gets right back to you. John, do you know?
Yeah, I think that is a generative AI because it's
Yeah,
trained on a training database and it's
yeah,
uses that to generate predictions.
yep, yeah. Um, that's a good question. All right, so there have been a whole bunch of different reactions to generative AI, and many of these I'm sure you know about already, but I felt compelled to include them here just for some more context. There was a huge writer strike in 2023 that was talking about how generative AI can be used as a tool, but not as a replacement for actual humans. I know many of my colleagues in the English department argued something very similarly, right? When there were all kinds of questions, like every other day, something on the Chronicle of Higher Education would, like feature a story that said, like, oh, is AI going to replace teachers? Like, are teachers all out of jobs? So the writer's strike really advocated that, like AI can be used, but it should not be used to replace human workers. And that the writer's strike was suggested to be used as sort of like a model for other companies that and other industries that are considering AI instead of using humans. I did just read something the other day, John, maybe I can't think of what the company was, but it was really recent. And they fired all of their human employees in favor of using AI tools instead. John, do you know did you see the same story? It was
I'm
something
not
pretty popular.
That one I didn't see, but there are some forecasts that within 5 to 10 years, 30% or so of all jobs will be replaced by augment humans doing the work in conjunction with AI tools. And it's going to lead to some major disruptions in the labor force.
Yeah, you're right. And I can't remember what it was that I just read. I'll have to look into it and get back to you guys. But I saw and I was very, very surprised. So people were sharing things online and saying like, no longer use this particular service because, like they've decided to switch only to AI. And you're right, Lisa, that many different businesses like have like those sorts of chatbots that generate information that's can be helpful but is very, very limited, right? So they can only do so many things. But yes, all of those are different kinds of AI tools. You're absolutely right. Yes, I do also, especially when they talk you in circles. So another community that responded really vehemently to generative AI was the animated community in Japan. Responded a lot to Dolly because, these images are not generated by humans. And in fact, the way that generative AI works is it basically takes little pieces and parts from things that have been programmed into it and rearranges them, right? And then kind of slaps them back together into a new image. So lots of Japan's anime community was like, what is this, right? Like we work really hard to create these images, and now we've got this tool that can make an image in seconds. And it's been really interesting. This past semester, I did some introductions to generative AI in my English composition classes to kind of just talk to my students about, and I gave them things to read about it and asked them to form opinions about it and whatever else. And many writers and artists that are undergraduates are feeling very similar frustrations, which I found to be really interesting and kind of encouraging too. That they're not just looking at this as like a really cool thing that's a way to cheat. Instead, they're really thinking about like what this means for them as artists and humans, right, in their fields. People who are trying to find jobs after they graduate, which is a whole other conversation, right, that we could have. Okay, so some of the challenges that have come with generative AI are thinking about copyright considerations, and there are a lot of things kind of happening right now in regard to copyright and OpenAI. So I've quoted some stuff from OpenAI's website, and again, that's the company that has created ChatGPT and DALL-E. And it talks about how these language models are trained, right? So they're developed using three primary sources of information. Information that is publicly available on the internet, which is huge, right? There's so much information publicly available online. Information that is licensed from third parties, and information that our users or our human trainers provide. So some of the problems that have arisen from unpacking this policy is that there have been several writers who have filed lawsuits against OpenAI, including John Grisham and Jodi Picoult and George R.R. Martin, big names, right? They have noticed when they input information about their books into the AIs can answer them, right? So if Jodi Picoult says, identify the protagonist in my novel Mad Honey and talk to me about, why they are a complicated character, the AI can respond, right? So these writers are saying, like, these AIs have read my books, right? And like my books are copyrighted. How is this possible? What's interesting, right, is that it's a big thing, because you have to think about anything that you input into one of these large language models, they save, right? And then retain so that they can use it to spit out more content. So, like if I, as a user, put in a section from Jodi Picoult's book, right? If I type it in or if I scan it in, if I'm using more advanced technology, then now the AI has that information, right? So there's a huge lawsuit kind of going through. The New York Times is also involved against OpenAI, kind of talking about how OpenAI shouldn't have access to their articles because it's the New York Times, right? And how that could damage their business. But there's a lot of pushback from many writers and from many businesses against OpenAI, thinking about this idea of copyright and who owns this information, and can ChatGPT have access to this information or not. So this is just some of the stuff that's been kind of going around, right? Kind of about this whole issue. Does anybody have any questions for me so far? Or does everything sound okay?
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm curious about, and I might have missed this when you first started talking about the copyright and, the ownership of information. But for instance, information that we use in private, like a Google Doc or something that's in our private account, is that accessible to these language models, or is it more public domain websites and databases and so forth? Well, databases are even protected, right? Like through
Yeah.
Yeah, so
That's an excellent question. So, the AI will have whatever you put into it. So, like, one of the things I'll talk about a little bit later, like if you were to take information from your Google Doc and input it into a generative AI program, then now the AI program has that information and has that language, right? But if you don't do that, right, then it does not. But like any like things that are online, right? Like any of those general websites are kind of up for grabs. Databases so far, and John, correct me if I'm wrong on this. are pretty safe, because although many different AIs have access to the web, many AIs have access, like there's one generative AI that's called Research Rabbit that like looks through different online databases and stuff like that. A lot of that stuff is more open access, so it can do that. But like to my knowledge so far, there aren't any AIs that can specifically look through like private databases like what Penfield Library has, unless somebody inputs information from a specific article like into the AI. John, is that right, or has that changed?
Well, material that's private that you store in Google Drive or Dropbox is not accessible. Only
Right.
things that it can find on the web. Now, library stuff, it might very well because there is that interface for, at least some material from libraries could be scraped,
But
but not
most of it would be okay, right? Like in our like with unless it's like in an open access journal or something.
Yeah, I'll just add the library databases, we pay a lot of money for them. So they're protected behind all kinds of protections. But I think Stephanie's point is fully accurate that if a couple of points just about that. One is an author could also post their same article or like a preprint into an institutional repository, in which case they could access it that way, but they wouldn't be able to get it through the paid database.
Okay.
If that helps clarify.
Definitely.
But as
Um,
soon as someone loads it in to say, oh, help me with this, summarize this article for me, this research article, then it's in the AI and then people have access to it.
Yep, absolutely. And that's like the thing. That's one of the things that makes this so tricky is that, like if a student, for example, is having a hard time understanding an article, then they can copy and paste either sections or the whole thing, right, into ChatGPT and say, like, summarize this for me. And now the AI has that information and has that article. So Lisa, yeah, absolutely. Like if somebody took like an abstract, right, and and abstracts are short. So like if a student I'll just pick on a student, right? Like if a student were to copy and paste an abstract from one of your papers and put it into ChatGPT, then it's there.
And actually, the journals themselves generally post the abstracts online, so those would be at least potentially part of the database.
Yep. Does anybody have any other questions before I keep going?
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering also at what point will these AI okay, at what point will there be so much garbage in here that the AIs are pulling from? Already, I'm sure there's plenty of garbage, but at what point will the garbage outweigh the good stuff as, of what they're pulling from? Or do we not see that being an issue?
Well, something I'll talk about in a little bit is bias within AI. Actually, it's my next slide. And I mean, I would equate bias to right to that sort of thing. And that's definitely a really big problem. I don't know if we can predict like when that might happen. I do know that a lot of the AI companies are claiming that they are working very, very hard to eliminate as much bias as possible within their large language models. John, do you have things to add to that?
Yeah, actually, there is this phenomenon with large language models called drift. And what happens is some of them did really well at first, but as the database grew and so forth, they did bring in more garbage. And for example, ChatGPT 3 and 3.5 did really well with many math problems initially, where it was like 95% accurate. After a period of months, it dropped down to being somewhere like 30 or 40% accurate with the same types of problems. And there is an issue, following Sarah's question there is an issue where more and more content online is created by large language models. It's sort of like making it, the database is going to expand to include more stuff that AI models have created. And that leads to degradation of the data because, large language models are not always very accurate in terms of their sources and so on. And when it starts using more input from large language models to generate new predictions, it could become lower quality. Now, they're trying to work to prevent that, but there are concerns that that's going to happen as they become more ubiquitous.
Thank you, John. All right, so the thing to really keep in mind, right? And I mean, I think that generative AI can be incredibly helpful and it can do some really, really cool things. Just as kind of like a hopper to everything that I'm saying here. But the thing to keep in mind is that it is like trained, right, on this huge collection of material. But the fascinating thing about AI and bias is, you know, all of the material that generative AI receives is from the humans who are programming it, right? And because humans are generally flawed creatures who do make bad choices sometimes, not all of the data is going to be good data, right? So there's a link here that talks about an example of AI and bias, and I'll switch over here for just a second so that you can see. I don't find the graph terribly helpful, but the blurb at the top is what I find really fascinating, and a few people have written about this so far. I'm looking like right in this area, right, where with the word Amazon. So this happened a couple of years ago in 2017 or 2018. Amazon was going through and they were doing like a big hiring burst, right? And they were looking through all kinds of resumes, and they had a generative or an AI tool that was helping them look through resumes. And somewhere along the way, the word women became a negative keyword, and a whole bunch of female applications were like rejected because they had that negative keyword. So it's a really, and then obviously Amazon like realized what was happening and then stopped it and whatever. But it's really interesting how going through, right, the AI begins to learn and then starts to make I'll say like assumptions, right, based on what it learns, right, what it's programmed with or how it's programmed. So as a different example, one generative AI tool was asked to sort through pictures of dogs and wolves. And I find this really fascinating. After a little while, the AI tools got confused when wolves were depicted in summer and dogs in winter, or that's a typo, when wolves were depicted in summer and dogs were depicted in winter, because it had learned to recognize wolves in like snow. Right. So after a while, after all of these images of wolves in snow had been loaded in and loaded in and loaded in, if you put a picture of like a wolf in the summertime, it had a hard time recognizing that because there are far fewer images of wolves in summer than it had wolves in winter, right? That it had received at that point, right? Um, Another example of regular AI tools, right, are all different kinds of facial recognition software, right? There's a wonderful book that I would highly recommend. It's in Penfield. That's called AI and Diversity by Roger Sora. And there's a whole chapters about like AI and some of the different problems that AI recognizes, right? And there's a whole chapter about facial recognition software and how, you know, like these tools are problematic, especially in identifying people of color. I would highly recommend the book. I'll put the name in the chat in just a second. There we go. Okay. Moving on, thinking about some of the different ways that generative AI is limited or more recently is not limited. So for a while, generative AI was really limited when it came to being able to access information after September 2021. Information past September 21 wasn't like couldn't really be accurate, right? So like for a little while when I was doing work on the AI task group and stuff, some of the advice that we were giving faculty was like, oh, try to give assignments that are more recent or that are about like current events or things that are currently happening in our world because the AI tools don't have access to that information. That has changed. So this past September, many generative AI tools now have access to like the web, right? So they have information about all different kinds of current events. So it's not limited in its knowledge anymore, right? So it has access to all kinds of information. One thing that is really important to know, though, and this is something that I spent a lot of time speaking with my students about, just like other kinds of information literacy, right? It's really important to be able to evaluate the kinds of information that the generative AI tools produce. So I love this word. I think it's great. And it's so accurate, right, for describing what generative AI does. So the word hallucination is the word that we use when we explain what happens when AI tools make stuff up. And this happens actually like a lot of the time, right? So like if an AI tool perhaps doesn't know an answer to a question that you ask it, or perhaps it can't provide something that you're looking for, it has a tendency to make up an answer, right? This happens quite frequently in regard to citations. So I have a link here. This is a very, very short article that was published in the American Journal of Medicine about, like how some students were using AI tools and they were looking for references for their paper that they were writing. And the AI tool suggested a reference, like a book or something that didn't exist, right? It made up the whole thing. It made up the author, it made up the title of the book, the publishing company, the year of publication. It even gave a fake DOI. So when the students clicked on the DOI and then realized that it didn't go anywhere, they had to start like unpacking the suggestion that the AI tool made. But hallucinations can happen beyond just making up citations, right? Like AI tools can make up all kinds of things. So one of the things that we as users need to really be aware of is to not trust everything that the AI tools say to us. And I think if you're doing anything with students, making them aware of this is like huge, right? Sort of like, like when the internet was first a thing and we had to learn that like not everything on the internet is true, right? It's sort of a similar kind of concept. Does this make sense so far? Does anybody have any questions so far? Cool. All right. So, I have a ChatGPT account, and I use it, like semi-regularly, mostly just to play around and whatever. So, I want to let everybody know, right? It's in my opinion, and John, I'd be curious to hear your input on this as well. But in my opinion, if you are working with students and you're receiving work from students, right? It's a good idea to know some general information about generative AI so that you can be aware, so that you can suspect more accurately whether or not your students might be using these tools. Um, I would encourage everybody to at least sign up for a free account and play around with it just so that you can see what it's capable of, so that you can see what it does, so that you can just know, right, like what this technology can do. John, do you have feelings?
Yeah, it's hard often to detect, other than that if you see student work without grammatical errors, without spelling errors, and so forth, there's at least some chance that either the student happens to be a really good writer or it may have been generated by AI. And that you'll see some common sort of patterns with responses, or if you see students turning in things that sound remarkably similar to other students, there's a good chance they're doing it. But there really is no great way of detecting it. While companies are selling AI detectors, they're incredibly poor, with some studies suggesting that they are up to where their failure rate is about 50% of both false positive and false negatives. They advertise 80 to 90%, but when they're tested by others outside of their own institution or outside of their business, they don't do so well. And one other thing that adds complication is that non-native speakers are more likely to have work that's detected as AI simply because they've learned how to write in a more formulaic manner than native speakers, who are much less structured in their writing. So they're not, it's not easy to tell, or it's not easy to document that something is done by AI, other than perhaps talking to the student.
And yeah, absolutely. And I should clarify what I said, because I said that badly. Mostly I would encourage you to play around with it just so that you can see what it does, right? And like one thing that I've done before and some of my other colleagues have done as well, put your assignment into it. See what it spits out, right? See how it handles it, right? Those sorts of things so that you can better get a feel for, right? Like how your students might potentially use these sorts of tools. But I think it's a good idea to at least play around with it so that you can see what it does before I tell everybody to go like sign up for it though. You should know some things, right? Like you should know that ChatGPT does collect some information about you, right? It asks you for your name, it asks you for your phone number. Like I can, like when you log in, and then it talks a little bit about how, like, if you use the services, like it would collect personal information that's included in anything you input into it. So, like, one of the things that you should know and always keep in mind is never put any information that's like personal or sensitive into generative AI. Just don't do it, right? Because again, anything you put in, it now has. Okay. So like if you're going to use generative, like I use generative AI tools sometimes to help me like at work, right? Like if I'm doing different work related tasks, like for example, like I talked earlier this morning about like making a rubric, right? I don't make rubrics, so I use generative AI to help me get started. Something like that would be totally okay, right? But if I'm putting in information, like let's say that I'm like hiring a new employee, right? And I want to like write up their contract. Like I would never put their personal information into generative AI to help me write that contract. That would be very bad. So do think about like, and you can go to ChatGPT's privacy policy and like read the whole thing. I've only highlighted little bits and pieces of it here, but you should know, right, that it does ask you for your name. It does ask you for your phone number when you sign up. And then obviously if you do the paid version, then there's, you put in some more information too. Okay. So, here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna just keep sharing my screen and we can do this together because there are a couple of more points that I wanna hit and we have a little bit less, or we've got about 10 minutes to go. So here are some scenarios. I'll give you a moment to read them, and then please feel free to put the one you would like to do in the chat, and I'll pick one and we'll put it into the generative AI and see what it does. Okay, there's two for this one, so this is the one we're gonna do. All right. Sorry, my mouse is not doing what I want it to do. Highlight. There we go. All right, so this is something I was doing earlier in a previous presentation. So this is what ChatGPT looks like when you log in. Over here off to the left are all of your saved chats. And then down here, like at the bottom, right, you see it says message ChatGPT. If you were to, you might be able to see it. If you were to like log in and make an account and the whole thing, this is what you would do. Just go down right here to the bottom. Anytime I am putting in new information, I always go up here to new chat. I just find it nicer and easier to keep my separate things together. You can delete whatever you want. You can archive stuff, etc. So I'm going to paste in the prompt that we chose, which was acting like a high school senior, writing a personal statement for a college application. Here we go. And I'll scroll back up in a second when it's done writing. Okay. So pretty amazing, right? It wrote the whole thing in 7 seconds, maybe. So I'm gonna just kind of hover right here and I'll give you a couple of minutes to skim. I agree with you, Lisa, that this is very sophisticated language. Can I have reactions from others?
So you could actually just say like things about themselves, saying like they were a on a specific team, maybe they were in this whatever club. They can just throw that on there, and then that they will populate that into the essay as well.
Yep. And I mean, I should say, so I've got like a whole other thing, right, that I'm not going to get into today, but like this that I put in right here, right, is what I have prompted the AI with, right? It's relatively general, right? So if I were to make this prompt a lot more specific, then I would get a much more specific answer. So like for fun, let's go off of Lisa's suggestion, which was that this is way too sophisticated for a high school senior. So let's re-prompt the generative AI and see what happens. So the thing that you want to keep in mind is that anytime you put something in, once you start the conversation, right? You can like just continue chatting with the general AI. So, and it will kind of start to pick up on like your writing style and like it gets better usually the more you play with it. Okay. So like Lisa's suggestion was that it was too sophisticated. So that's what I'm going to tell ChatGPT. This is too sophisticated for me. Can you rewrite this essay in a ninth grade tone, please? Should we add anything else? Should I
Captain of the
ask it?
soccer team.
What was it, Scott?
Captain of the soccer team.
Sure.
I was just going to ask that. Can you list like things like in bullet point format or list format, just keywords that then it would plug in?
Yeah, if you wanted to, you could keep it like more brief, right? So every time you push enter, it's going to like put this chat in. So, but you could tell it, I am sending you a list of bullet points. They're coming in the next chat, right? And I will tell you when my bullet points are done. And then like it will wait for you to send all of your information, and then you can tell it to begin after that if you don't want to write in sentences. Yeah. So I'm saying, can you rewrite this essay like a ninth grade, or I'm gonna just say like a ninth grader, like a ninth grader. I was captain of the soccer team, and do we want anything else?
National Honor Society.
Volunteered at my local pet shelter.
I also volunteered at the local pet shelter. How about this? Tell a story about an animal that changed my life. See what it does. So this is writing like a ninth grader. Any reactions to this one?
I find this one quite believable.
I agree. Much more what I would expect a person of that age to style of writing.
I agree. It's still, I mean, it has like some stuff, right? Like going on, but I mean, it's still relative, like the grammar and whatnot, right? Is still pretty spot on. You could, if you wanted, you could have the AI like rewrite it with like a couple of like typos if you wanted, right? You could like request that.
It will reject that though, and will
Oh, will
say
it?
the AI tool, I'm not allowed to do that, or at least the last time I tried that.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, good to know. Um, I think that this is really interesting too, right? Like we had the local pet shelter and then I asked it to make up a story and it made up a pretty good story, I think, like gave the dog a name. And he didn't trust anyone, but then he started to trust people and like isn't that like just such a beautiful metaphor for going to college? Um, so not all of like many of our students don't understand how to do prompts in this way, right? Like how to like manipulate the generative AIs to like sound more believable just yet. There's a whole thing about this. It's called prompt engineering, that I would be happy to talk about more, right, in another session. But it's the thing to remember, right, is the more you integrate or the more you communicate with this, the better it will get, and it will tailor its responses based on the feedback that you give it. So there are a lot of possibilities. I am just about out of time. I had a couple of other slides, so what I'm going to do is stick the link to this in the chat before we go. And then that way you will be able to access it. And then if you want to talk any more about the content in the slides that are remaining, I would be very happy to do that because I talked for too long. Does anybody have any final questions for me? Great. Please let me know if things come up. My email address and contact information and whatever are right in the PowerPoint. So I would be happy to speak with you more. Have an awesome day.
Thanks, Stephanie. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.